Okay, we're going to start with just a brief discussion. I'll ask Brett a few questions, and then we will open up the floor for those of you who want to engage with her. Brett, when I first saw this film, I was really struck by the mood and the kind of tone of the piece. Can you talk a bit about how that came about? Did you set out with this? Did it emerge as you were filming over time?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for coming. It's so great to see a packed room, and thanks for staying, and thanks to all the folks that have made this amazing gathering possible. It seems like an incredible lineup. Yeah, I mean, there's been a few ways that I've described both the origins and even the subject of this film. So sometimes I describe it as a climate change film, and I like to see what that provokes. But there have been times in which I just described it as a film about dread. And in some ways, that's how it began. You know, I among many other sort of ways of thinking about the current crises and the intersecting crises of this moment, this film at least partly emerged out of my own sort of desire to reconcile my relationship to the kind of dread that was you know, that I was feeling and that I am feeling upon, you know, awakening every morning, and wanting to think about that feeling. Not maybe is this being funny? Okay. Okay, like this? Okay. Yeah, I wanted to think about this not as a sort of personal affliction or, you know, even just a feeling, but politically. What does it mean to try and think about dread politically? What does it mean to think about dread as something that's a communal, you know, if not a communal emotion, then at least a sort of communal part of the emotional fabric of this moment, and how does that shape, you know, I have questions about how that shapes how we relate to each other, how we move forward, what we build, what we make. And so, yeah, the film was always going to be at least partly about the sort of emotional life of climate change, as well as the structural crises of climate change.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I really enjoyed about it was it feels like we wander through, this is sort of a wander through a specific moment in time, and yet it also feels out of time. And sometimes and then other times it feels like the past, present, and future are compressed. And I think the use of the sound helps to create this kind of sense of a little bit of unmooring and of not quite knowing where we are, or a sense of liminality. We're kind of betwixt in between something which is this sense of dread of what's coming next. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about some of these choices that you made in terms of how you tried to convey that sense of dread for people.
Sure. So the way I often work in my films, I make political films that use sort of formal limits to try and ask questions that I don't necessarily have the answers to. And so in the case of this film, it was always going to be a film set in one city over the course of 1 month. I became attached to the idea of trying to mine a particular place and period of time for insights. And I was thinking about it a lot in terms of the idea of an archive film, you know, the way in which we mine images and sounds from the past in our media to try and, you know, gain insight or new knowledge. And I was thinking a lot about what we're leaving for future generations who are going to be wanting to make sense of this moment, and especially wanting to make a kind of social sense. What were people thinking? What were people doing? What were people saying to make sense of how they and we organize our own extinction and the extinction of others? And And so I became enamored with the idea of trying to create an archive film that didn't have to wait for time to pass before it got organized into a film. So I think my editor and I especially, when I handed off the footage to him, I handed him about 110 hours of footage after filming for 30 days. And we liked the idea of sort of unsettling our sense of our relationship to the time and the relationship to the place, So it's meant to, the voice that you hear is meant to evoke some sense of it coming from the future, but not nailing it to a particular date, but just sort of offering these moments where we could feel very, very grounded in the intimacies of ordinary life in the present, and also use the sort of language of cinema to evoke either the perspective of another kind of species or the perspective that's estranged through time in some way.
Right. And you really get that in the narration in the beginning and the end, this kind of third-person distant looking back. And it's a quite subtle but effective way in kind of tweaking our orientation to what we're seeing on screen. And the other thing I noticed in addition to the music, which is sort of eerie, is often we don't always hear the sync sound in situations, and that also adds. So these very small decisions that you made help create, like on the subway, everybody's pressed in and you see faces at the window and you don't hear anything, and it is this sense of we're already archived ourselves in the future.
What we hear, so I worked with this really amazing sound artist, Ernst Carroll, who's most known for some of the films he makes with the Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab. But he adds, part of the soundscape on that subway scene is just the sound of water.
Exactly.
And, when he did that, it wasn't like exactly rational. It was just sort of, he just added this sound, and the sort of movement of that space feels different because it's a subway car, it's jostling, but it's underground, it's itself in a kind of liminal space, and water is already a theme in the film. And so we tried to have these moments in which the sound was both sort of grounded. If we recognized it wasn't too apart from us human beings, but it did some work to unsettle our sense of what's going on, what reality is.
Exactly. And then the other side of it, which you've referenced, is I feel like we get to relish people's individual idiosyncrasies in quite a wonderful way. And in some sense, it reminded me of some of Errol Morris's early work, like Vernon, Florida, and Gates of Heaven, about the pet cemetery, where you just have pet owners sitting down and being asked about why they decided to bury their pets and honor them the way they're honoring them. And it's sort of this full display of the range of behavior and affect, and I think you really captured that very well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that it takes a lot of work to fight a lot of bad feelings about living in this moment, including for me, sort of at times a creeping misanthropy. I mean, there's moments in which I read the newspaper and I think the best thing would be if all humans just cease to exist. We're doing these terrible things, and so I say that so that I can also say it was really important for me. It's always important for me when I make my films. They're tremendous gifts because they remind me of how incredible human beings are. Right. I mean, we're complicated. We're selfish. We're generous. We're full of desire and pathos. And I really wanted this film to be a reminder, even when you're encountering things, or when I was encountering things that I opposed in terms of things that people would say or disagreed with. they were always getting to spend time with people was always a reminder to take people seriously, and I feel like one of the things I'm interested in is just how people differently are narrating their anxieties. What are the vocabularies that are made available for us? What are the different vocabularies and frameworks that are made available for us to make sense of our fears and to make sense of our lives? And so those taking people's words seriously, even while we're also invited to be sort of critical readers of what we're hearing in the film, was really important.
And amused, or we're critical readers, but we're also amused by the gestures and the expressiveness. And I feel like the way that you made those edits really helped to
It's always nice when people laugh, because I think things are funny. Someone bringing a duck
People
to
are
a
funny.
baseball game, it's funny. We should laugh.
Yeah. And then can you talk a little bit about the structure and how you came to this and how you sort of organized? That's a lot of footage to organize.
Yeah, I mean, it was very difficult. So just to give you a sense, we shot, pretty much over the course of 1 month, give or take a couple of days. And then we edited over a year. So part of that was, this was a film that was going to be made in the edit room. This was not a prescriptive film. This is not a film, in which I was interviewing people for sound bites or expertise or sort of nuggets of information. And so the structure was not, wasn't obvious. There's no dramatic arc to this film. And it was always going to be structured associatively. So the process was really about sort of rewatching the footage and looking to see what kind of portrait starts to emerge. I mean, I think of this film sometimes as a rejoinder to something that the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher is famous for saying, which is, there's no such thing as society. There's only individuals and their families. And so I wanted to make a film that, in its form, insists that there is such thing as society. Right. So part of the work of structuring the film was to take all of these moments, these encounters and these observations, and seeing what kind of portrait of a society starts to emerge and what kind of echoes we could find. So it was, noticing, there's a guy. There's a guy that leans out his window and says something that gets repeated by another man who leans out of his truck. Those two men say the same thing, that they're told that they can go to college, get a job, or join the military when they get out of college. So looking for these kind of echoes and looking for places where we could make juxtapositions between the footage or between scenes that would add up to something new, and sort of structuring out from there.
Right, and giving people sort of space to go into the movie and experience for themselves and make some decisions for themselves instead of being told how to feel.
And even just sort of rest. I mean, there's definitely passages that are, that subway scene, for example. I mean, we're just there for a long time, or we're on the beach, and you're allowed to get bored with the image, precisely because in that boredom, I hope anyways, there's room for your own experiences and thoughts and memories to start to encounter what you're hearing and what you think you're, what kind of sense you're starting to make of what you're watching.
Right, exactly, and create your meaning instead of you telling us exactly what to think. And can you talk just a little bit before we open this up in terms of your hopes when you were working on this and when you finished this, in terms of what impact or effect it could have in terms of its political point?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, part of the origin of this film was that I was also not only noticing my own dread, but noticing my own disinterest in a lot of climate change films. And I think of myself as very politically involved and environmentally conscious and certainly invested in the climate crises. And yet not, there's a way in which I feel disengaged when it comes to a lot of moving image work around climate change. So I was trying to figure that out, and I was thinking about how, in my experience anyways, a lot of these works seem like they're premised on delivering information that I don't feel like I need anymore. Like, I feel like the information is there. Insofar as these works are meant to sort of convince people that climate change is real. I mean, I already believe it's real. I already believe it's a crisis. Right. And so I was trying to think through what there still is to learn, and obviously there's a lot to learn. And I wanted to think about what kind of work could at least attempt to put the climate crisis in conversation with the crisis of inequality and capitalism and racial violence and white supremacy and all, the multitude of crises that we're facing, and also sort of be a way of investigating the questions about power. I think one of the questions that this film asks, or at least that I'm trying to ask through it, is what people do with their fear when they don't feel like they have power. And that, for me, is a question that I'd like some answers to. And so that's all I can do in a film, is try and use a film to ask questions that feel like the answers would be useful. And so insofar as any film can be part of, the long struggle of this moment, I hope that it unsettles us offers us some sort of a way of critically appraising our what we're doing on this planet, and provokes conversations with people. I mean, invites people to share a room with each other. Part of the film also for me is really about sort of what kind of future there is in aloneness, how people feel terribly alone. What are the different the sort of way in which we're structured into feeling like any possible means of navigating the future are available only to us in individual terms. And so if the film can be an occasion to have people share space or go out afterwards and have a conversation with others, then that feels like something productive.
Right. Okay. I think we're going to open up for some questions.
Hi. I feel like I know my city, and so a lot of the places that you filmed in, they're not totally familiar, but I got a sense that most of it was in Brooklyn, and so I was really surprised, that might not be the case, but I was surprised to see Lisa from Take Back the Bronx, Dynamite Woman. So I'm just wondering how you chose the people and locations.
So Lisa's the woman that you see in close-up towards the end of the film. So there was a couple of different strategies. Most of the time, it was what you see sort of at the beginning of the film, where we literally just went places, and we cast for locations more than we did people. I genuinely wanted to just encounter strangers and take conversations where other people wanted to lead them. And so there's something about trying to organize spontaneous encounters that's more challenging than you'd think. But we would, and there was a small team of us, myself, a producer, a cinematographer, and a sound person, so 3 or 4 of us, and we would think about just places where we could go, where I might be able to walk up to people and start a conversation with them. So most of the time, most of the people that you meet, it's me meeting them for the first time. So that was the main thing that we did. And we thought a lot about sort of how space is organized. So the film takes place a lot in public space. And there is a lot of Brooklyn, but we traveled to all 5 boroughs, so there's quite a lot of Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island as well. Manhattan is actually much more difficult because, for a bunch of reasons, but including just the fact that the space is really dense. And so it's really, you learn really quickly when you're making a film in which you want to engage strangers in long, intimate conversations that 9 o'clock in the morning on a Monday on a sidewalk is not the best place to tap someone on the shoulder. And so the other thing we did, though, was we contacted, I sent out a sort of like very general email to everyone, basically everyone I knew in the city, and said, I'm making this film that's composed of conversations with strangers. Can you just think of 1 or 2 people in your life that you think might be game to talk to me? I'm not going to tell you what it's about. It's generally about how people are doing this summer. But just anyone in your life. It could be your car mechanic. It could be your ex-boyfriend. It could be your aunt, you know, whoever it is. And so some people came to us that way. And I had known Lisa through my work as a prison activist and doing work around solitary confinement issues. But then actually someone else who was on that email list suggested her. And that's how, I just wrote her, and that's how that interview came about.
I was going to ask the same question, but instead I'll ask a follow-up. When you approached the people, what percentage of them actually ended up on the film, and how many others either turned you down or gave you an uninteresting or, you know, an interview that you decided to just leave out?
Well, I'll say that a lot of interviews were left out despite being very interesting. So actually, you know, it was a really hard film to edit because I don't know, my sort of feeling is that, like, you talk to anybody and anybody's interesting. Like, you just ask people real questions about their lives and you open up a world. And
I don't think you're a geographer. I think you're a bit of an anthropologist.
well, there's a lot of kinship there. And you know, the other thing is that people are so much more generous than even I expect them to be. I mean, I'm not terribly outgoing. I feel it takes me a lot of nerve to work up to, you know, asking someone if they'll speak to me. And the majority of people say yes. The majority of people, you know, I'll ask a question like, when do you feel lonely? And people will answer that question. It's really tremendous. And I think, you know, there were a couple of things that sort of made some interviews harder to use. One of which actually was the fact that this was shot in August of 2017, and people wanted to talk about Donald Trump. And we felt that was a distraction. We felt like that was sucking up all the sort of focal energy and time. You know, and one might disagree, but there was a sense going into this film that his presidency is symptomatic of the kinds of crises that the film is trying to examine, rather than a cause of the crises. So we didn't want it to become about Trump. So we had to edit that out, and that shaped how we made decisions about who to be in the film and what clips we'd use.
This question is really for over here, for the audience. Hi, audience, we came here, right? So I want to know if we're going to go home or talk to somebody, or at least 3 people, and say something either about this film, about what we can do about climate chaos. So if we are open to that, could we please just raise our hand? Okay, great. Then your film is succeeding. And that is what I wanted to give you, that you spoke about isolation and you're breaking the isolation here. So thanks for naming that and having us be willing to talk to each other. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for that.
I was very interested with the man in the spacesuit. Where'd you find him? And being that
Was he just wandering around in that suit?
Well, I mean, I was just intrigued. I mean,
Yeah.
was it
So
air going on in there? I mean, it was.
So there was a few, you know, the other thing that we did was we just read the newspapers a lot to find out what was going on that month, and that month there happened to be an art exhibit. So, you know, another example is the Wrecking Club. You know, I read a newspaper article about the Wrecking Club, and then I went. But, so his name is A.O., and he's a local artist, and he had a show that was going on, and I don't think he actually uses the term Afrofuturism so much right now, but in this piece that I read at the time, he described his work through the lens of Afrofuturism, and the questions that sort of aesthetic movement poses are very aligned with some of the questions that I'm interested in this film, which is, questions about how when you can't imagine yourself, when you don't see yourself represented in depictions of the future, how does that inhibit your capacity to build a future? And, in his work, he's asking that question about the state of being African American in this country in particular. But so I approached him, and I mostly just wanted to do an interview, but when we were doing the interview, he was like, and he showed me some posters of this old project of his where he was walking around in the spacesuit, and then we were already sort of playing with some spacey themes. And he's like, I think I still have that suit around somewhere if you want me to put it on. I'm not sure it'll fit. And I was like, oh my God, that would be so amazing. Yes, please. And so he just put it on and he walked around the neighborhood, which is what he does. I mean, that art project is about putting on that spacesuit, saying I'm an astronaut, and walking around and using that in different countries, in different neighborhoods to, as he described it, to engage people in conversations and to fully inhabit the sort of character of someone who's come back to this moment from the future to offer useful insights.
Well, being that it's climate, and this is just, that's a good response, but my question is, was it a real hot day?
Yeah, it was a pretty hot day. Yeah, he was not. He didn't want to stay in that suit too long. Yeah, yeah. He was very. It was very generous of him to humor us by walking around in that suit that day.
You've mentioned that you have edited out several of the main players in the film. What landed up on the editorial floor that you feel we should have seen?
It was very hard to figure out. There was a lot of making a film like this is so difficult because for some people there's a tendency to sort of self-analyze and to sort of give their own analyses of the crises of this moment, or seeming passivity, or sort of the problem of American politics. And some of that was incredibly powerful and fascinating. But there's a way in which it just didn't work with some of the other footage. Like there's I don't know, like I interviewed a couple of, I interviewed 3 academics who were in conversation with each other, and they had this amazing conversation about the sort of long history of racial injustice, economic inequality, and environmental injustice, and real estate, and they sort of gave this whole analysis, which was so powerful, and yet there wasn't a way in which it sort of then seemed like they were explaining everyone else in the film, and I didn't want the film to work on that in that way. I want to offer the subjects of the film as experts over their own lives and unreliable narrators. And I include myself in that. We're all doing the hard work from our own positions and our own experiences of using very limited vocabularies and frameworks to try and explain our feelings and our situations. And so I wanted everyone to sort of have kind of equal footing in how they come across in that way. So there was, sometimes it would just be like a tone thing. The other thing, there was a couple of people who do more sort of community organizing and activism, which I felt on the one hand felt like it was really important to present and say, like, this isn't just a film about people just living their own lives and their own struggles and not doing anything. Lots of people are doing a lot, and coming together and making common cause with others, and I wanted that to be present. But again, it was just, in the edit room, it was hard for that to come across. It tonally didn't work somehow. It's sort of hard to explain, but there's a part of me that was really heartbroken to leave some of that, people that are doing sort of more activist work on the cutting room floor.
I obviously throughout the film, and now we're talking about it, there was quite a bit of racism or counter-racism with, like, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement protest that we saw for a bit there. But I was wondering, as someone who grew up in Brooklyn myself, and I lived in Staten Island for a little bit, now I live in Manhattan. It's less of a problem here, though. But, like, there was a lot of blatant conservative-rooted misogyny, too, in addition to racism, by which I was surrounded all the time, and I was the one who rolled my eyes at the dinner table. My aunts and uncles aren't huge fans of me, but so I was wondering if you encountered any of that, like, she's just being a woman kind of stuff, too.
In regards to me?
With the, throughout the interview process.
Yeah, I mean, in all of my work as a filmmaker, there's a way in which I encounter and sometimes take advantage of being underestimated. People think I'm younger than I am. Like, you saw those guys, the cops in Staten Island.
Yeah, in the bar.
They think they know who I am, right?
Were they knocking on you for being from
I'm
Canada?
like a nice white girl, right? So they're both condescending, and they're indulging me because they think I'm safe. And maybe even they're flirting, right? Like, the misogyny works in that way too. Like, I was able to engage that conversation after sitting with them and having beers for a couple of hours. So yeah, I think that it was interesting because there's so much that for me I felt like I was picking up on after a month of doing this work that I don't know if it works its way into the film, and many things that don't. But there was a real way in which the sort of growing theme of isolation versus interdependence was gendered, and we know that, right? Like, so there's a lot of mothers who were taking care of kids or taking care of parents who were abandoned by men, and their understanding of, like, friendship, of building relationships, of fighting for anyone other than themselves is different from, at least, and maybe it doesn't always come across, but in my month of talking to people, it certainly came across to me, contrasted with both the willingness and capacity, much more prevalent among the men that I encountered, to imagine themselves as solitary agents capable of surviving this crisis through their own entrepreneurship and their own, good choices. And so that was very, very gendered. And yeah, I mean, at some point, like, my editor was just like, you can't have all these themes in your film, Brett, you have to focus. But I was like, have you noticed how many single mothers there are? Like, everybody we talk to, like, even Don at one point, Don's the guy who's like, loves his birds and is on the boat. Like, we don't have him talking about this, but he had this whole section in our interview where he talked about being raised by a single mother. Like, I was just like, everybody's raised by a single mother, or they are a single mother. That's our film. And he's like, no, that's not quite our film, but it's there, right? So yeah, long answer to your question.
No, thank you. I appreciate that, because the experience with the cops that I saw was all too familiar. It's part of the culture there, and it's shitty. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. It's bad. But thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hi, it sounds like you have so many other films to make out of the footage that you've collected, I was wondering about the title. I'm trying to control myself and not say any more. But why this title?
Oh, but you know, I would love for you to say more because, I mean, it really is a project where I'm sort of like, now it lives in your imaginaries. What does it mean to you? So if you have something to say about the title, I would love to hear it, or I could just tell you what I was thinking.
I'd like to hear, okay, I asked first, how about that? I will share what I'm thinking, but I would really appreciate it if you told us.
Sure. I mean, you know, a couple of things. One was every month was the hottest, right? So it's about anticipation. It's about the expectation. It's about living in a time in which, you know, it's going to be the hottest March. It's going to be 2020 is going to be the hottest year. So it doesn't matter if it actually was. Of course, I couldn't know if it was going to be the hottest August, but insofar as the film is about living and inhabiting in a time of anticipation and expectation of growing calamity, then the idea of the hottest signifies that. And then on the other hand, it's also about like heat as a kind of you know, metaphor for tension, right? Like one of the references for this film in a sort of oblique way is Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. You know, it's about like what happens in a city where people are like dealing with a lot of shit and it gets hot and like the tensions are just like rising to the surface. So the idea of the hot summer is also meant to evoke and gesture towards the sort of social tensions.
I really appreciate your saying that because that's exactly what I was thinking about. I was thinking about Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing and how it's not in the title at all, and the entire film is about this hot day. And here it is in your title, and I did not feel that anybody was especially hot. In the sense of, except maybe the dog and the sprinkler, which is absolutely adorable. Yeah, I didn't feel like and I know how I feel in New York City in July and August, and I didn't feel like anybody felt like I feel.
Yeah.
They all seemed fine.
Yeah. It was also like a weirdly rainy month. So, and rain is really hard to film. We were like, what are we going to do about the fact that it rained all summer? And so like, but you know, rain is its own, you know, especially torrential rain, its own sign of climate change. But yeah, and it's really difficult to film. I actually just watched a documentary about the making of Do the Right Thing, and I'm forgetting the filmmaker's name, but I'll remember in a bit. And it's fascinating because, yeah, they're dealing with like the way in which camera equipment and crew and everything else starts to, the challenges of just filming when it's really hot outside.
I'm wondering how, because you spoke a little bit about work you do around prisons and how beyond just a sense of obviously collective liberation, how you are holding the work of both prisons and climate work and how your energy focuses in just two massive crises and how that feels.
Yeah. Massive crises that are very interrelated, right? I mean, I think, I consider myself a student of the prison abolition movement, and one of the things the prison abolition movement teaches us is that you know, that prison abolition is a transformative politic. It's not just about abolishing prisons, but it's about transforming the kind of society that could have prisons. And I feel like that's a really useful way to think about the climate crises. It's not just about reining in the climate crises. It's about transforming what kind of society, what kind of power relations give rise to the massive exploitation and extraction of resources in the name of profit, right? So, yeah, I think that I think the climate crises, like the prison industrial complex, are rooted in a capitalist system and a racist capitalist system. So, I feel like, and I think that those struggles are actually like on the ground in terms of organizing work have really come together. So there's a lot of coalition building between sort of environmental justice folks and prison justice folks, which I draw a lot of inspiration from.
My question is, there were some females that were speaking, giving feedback in terms of, climate change and social, economic effects. There was a Caribbean mother with her son in the kitchen. She was speaking about leaving something for her son to have once she passes, Do you think this would actually be a message that would actually reach out to, any political leaders in our New York State?
I mean, part of what, I don't know if this answers your question, but, sometimes when people watch this film, they're like, oh, a lot of people are talking about housing. You call it a climate change film, but like gentrification is a bigger theme, or people talking about housing. And, I think that is hopefully part of what it offers to anyone, including, I sort of don't put much trust in politicians to do anything without movements to push them. But I think that, what I find inspiring about some of the current politics of the moment is the way in which movements are pushing politicians to incorporate, even just looking at the Green New Deal, it's a plan that incorporates housing justice and healthcare justice and income inequality into the very fabric of its vision for an environmental future. So, yeah, if this film can be in any way part of helping change the discourse around, what we imagine. Part of the problem for me is also with a lot of these climate change films is that they just suggest that the climate or the environment is something over there. It's icebergs and it's polar bears over there. It's not mothers in their kitchen over here. And I think it's mothers in their kitchen over here. So whoever wants to watch the film or think with it, would be great. Sorry? Thank you.
Garner's attention.
So I think at this point, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you all for being here and asking your questions. Thank you to Brett Story.
Thanks to Meg.